With the release of SRD 5.2, I think it's time to start talking about what I've been up to for the past year. Swiftguard is a TTRPG system that I'm designing. It's a classless D20 fantasy system that offers deeper character customization, smoother gameplay, and encourages teamwork in some subtle ways. Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today, we're going to be discussing Swiftguard, the Dragon Mind TTRPG. Let's get into it. It all started in January of 2023. Before that, I was perfectly happy just playing a homebrewed version of 5th edition D&D, getting kind of excited seeing what D&D 2024 would have in store for us. I was even starting to float the idea of maybe creating a setting guide for the homebrew setting we were playing in, along with maybe some homebrew rules content to perhaps be a commercial product. Then, the Fire Nation attacked. In the blink of an eye, Wizards of the Coast completely burned their reputation with the TTRPG community and industry. And even though they did fulfill their initial promise of releasing SRD 5.2 into the Creative Commons, I think Mike Mearls put it best in his interview with Questing Beast when he said that even though D&D 2024, assuming it's the best version of the player's handbook to ever be written, it's just not cool to play D&D anymore. I realized the thing holding me back from making even bigger changes to 5e systems was that D&D was popular. And so it would have been easier from a commercial point of view to create something that was a lot more directly compatible with the most popular system. Nowadays, we're in a sort of cultural moment where a lot of other independent systems have the spotlight on them. MCDM's Draw Steel, Darrington Press's Daggerheart, Dungeon Coach's DC-20, along with other already established systems like Savage Worlds, Fate, Call of Cthulhu, Dragonbane, 13th Age. You can just rattle off a bunch of them, right? Now that being said, with all those systems that have much more divergent mechanics than 5th edition, even though this is now a new system, one thing I've been asked a lot is, why still use content from SRD 5.2? And I find that the answer to that question is the same as why build a fantasy system when there are other, much better known competitors putting their stamp on the industry? And who are you building this for? Who is your target audience? And the one answer is, it's for my table of my particular players. I built this system for my table, for the players that I've been playing with for almost a decade. The players who I've learned their likes, dislikes, what excites them, what frustrates them, what confuses them. We like fantasy games. So even though a lot of popular competitors commercially are also fantasy TTRPGs, I'm not explicitly making a commercially viable product. I'm making a product that would make my table happy. That being said, if you look at this packet, and you would pay for a more refined version with a fleshed out setting, art and pizzazz, and other soft advice for getting the most out of your character, I would like to know that. So please somehow tell me in the comments down below, or by joining the Swiftguard Discord with the invitation link in the description below. But all of that would be a really exciting bonus, not my base metric for success. Really, my metric for success is if this system would be preferable for our particular table than D&D 5e's normal rules, whether you're using the 2014 or 2024 versions. One last digression before I move on. In my last video, TTRPGs are more than escapism. I asserted that TTRPGs by their nature are beneficial because by asking players to roleplay, they're asking them to practice perspective taking. Now in that video, there's a very long discussion thread between myself and a commenter, with the commenter counter-arguing that if that's the goal, then 5e really isn't the system that matches best. And this was off of a claim I made that Swiftguard was designed with that kind of benefit in mind. And after that discussion and some reflection, ultimately, I agree with them. If your greatest priority is to maximize the amount of, say, emotional or mental health benefit out of a TTRPG, there might be systems that are better matches for particular tables. A more narrative-driven game, for instance, may help a lot of tables really get into the mind of their own character and get more acute insights of themselves. That being said, I still maintain that Swiftguard, even though it's built off of the same scaffolding as SRD 5.2, also serves as a benefit in this regard. Yes, it's not a rules-light system. There's a lot of chunky mechanics in it. But even in Megan A. Connell's book, Tabletop Role-Playing Therapy, 5e was the system she used in her therapeutic case studies. And again, I'm not saying Swiftguard is therapy or anything. All I'm saying is that playing any TTRPG helps players practice perspective taking, which in my opinion is a relatively healthy thing. Like in that last video, I'm going to quickly make a fitness analogy. If you want to increase your strength, resistance training like weightlifting is going to provide all sorts of health benefits. But that's a general statement, and that's a specific outcome. Some people can't just start like that. They need to start a little bit lighter, say with resistance bands, or even just some bodyweight exercises, or modified bodyweight exercises. In the same way, I find that games that are intensely narratively focused, to the point that it removes a lot of kind of the crunchy mechanics, those games don't match with as many tables as something that's a little broader like D&D. Yeah, D&D is crunchier, and in some ways, I actually think that makes it more accessible to more people. Yes, there's an element of brand recognizability, but I don't necessarily think rules light equals easier time for at least a significant amount of people, my own players included. We tried playing a rules light game where instead of skill bonuses, your character more had these general traits, and you were supposed to kind of figure out how those traits would match up in certain story moments. It was kind of like a blank canvas syndrome where my players ended up struggling a lot more because ultimately our table isn't full of theater kids. I have definitely played at other tables with other players and GMs that would find that a far superior experience to 5e, and more power to them. Again, this game is based on the preferences and likes and tastes of my particular table. And a lot of what it does is just take the parts of 5e that seemed the most frustrating and the most counter to what was producing great narrative moments, and smoothing them out a little bit in order to produce a specific experience. Now, when you scan Playtest Packet 1.2, which is linked in the description below, along with Playtest Adventure 1, one of the things that you'll probably immediately notice how much is similar to 5e. Creatures have hit points, armor classes, there are 6 attributes which pretty much calculate everything else, 18 skills that characters can be proficient in. Its main mechanic is that you roll a d20 and try to roll high. There are still the 3 types of d20 rolls, checks, attacks, and saves. That doesn't mean I didn't look outside the box at all. For example, in MCDM's Draw Steel, one of the kind of core features of that game that's being publicized is that it removed the attack roll as a step for damage resolution. And I floated that idea to my players, and they just like rolling the d20, and they also like rolling damage. So when it comes to the differences, first, unlike 5e, Swiftguard is a classless system. You still pick your character's species, and you set their 6 attributes, which are just the modifiers, no ability scores. And from there, you just have a pool of different abilities that you can choose from. So you might take an ability that makes you a better archer, or deal more damage with an axe, or unlock an ability to cast magic. My real purpose for this was for players to be focused more on what their character can do then get caught building expectations of what they think their character is, and then being disappointed by mechanics that don't necessarily match. My best example of this is the Ranger. When you hear the term Ranger, I guarantee different people have very different ideas of what a Ranger would look like mechanically. I've had some players insist that Rangers are the archers. Other players want their Rangers to be non-casting martial survivalists. And of course, some people are perfectly happy with their Rangers being these half martial, half casters that they are in 5e. Instead of arguing what a Ranger should be, I'd rather players think about who their character is and pick the abilities that let them do what they want them to do. If one player insists that their character as a Ranger is a master archer, go for the archery abilities. If someone else is more focused on the survivalist aspect, pick abilities that match that. A counter argument I came up with pretty early on had to do with balance issues. In an early design video for Draw Steel, Matt Colville talked about a la carte systems are much more difficult to balance than class systems. And I can agree, and 5th edition demonstrated how when you allow multiclassing, you're gonna get a broken game anyway. So rather, I just kind of unlocked the class progression so that you can kind of pick the abilities that would make sense for your character. And I also think you'll actually get to see a lot more niche abilities in play. For example, one of the features that I think is really cool in 5e is the Thief Rogue's Fast Hands that allow you to interact with objects as a bonus action. However, in order for a character to get that, they would need to invest in at least 3 levels of Rogue, which may or may not be the class they want, and they have to give up a lot of other powerful Rogue subclass features in order to get this like really neat side feature. So instead, if you imagine your character, for example, as a Master Samurai, you might spend a lot of abilities that help you deal damage, but you can also pick up this kind of quick fast hands ability on the side without feeling like you're derailing your character's entire power progression. Now, speaking of power progression, Swiftguard features a completely reworked action economy. To use some abstract terms, the main action types in 5e are your action, which is like the big thing you get to do during your turn, movement, possibly a bonus action if you have a spell or feature that allows for it, and possibly a reaction. Now, in 5e, a lot of the balance in character creation kind of boiled down to your bonus action. If you weren't cognizant of it, you had this third action that you pretty much couldn't use. And these action types, at least in my experience with my players at my table, would often lead to a lot of frustration. For example, you're a fighter, and you have your sword and you run up to the bad guy, and you spend turns using your action to attack them. Well, as long as you're staying next to the bad guy, you don't have to move at all. So it kind of feels like you're wasting part of your turn economy by not moving. Other times, I got into this situation, say, where I had a spellcaster with a monk, and the spellcaster didn't need to move. They used their action, casted a big spell, the creature succeeded their save, and they dealt half damage. Meanwhile, the monk is making all sorts of these attacks, using their bonus action to flurry of blows, and their action to thwack, and they have all these movement bonuses. From a purely mathematical perspective, they kind of contributed the same amount of damage. But the spellcaster felt like their turn was less fulfilling because they didn't get to use their movement and bonus action in the same way the monk did. It looked like the monk was doing a lot more, and the monk's turn took longer, so from a psychological perspective, the gameplay didn't feel equal. Now, during the whole OGL fiasco, my players and I contemplated converting to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. We held one playtest session that ended with the conclusion, nope. Character creation took so long, and there were so many unnecessary mechanics to track. But there were some aspects I found intriguing. First of all, being the 3-action economy. I loved the idea of basically having a unified action type with the rest of the options balanced around that economy. Now that being said, spellcasting costs 2 of your 3 actions on a turn. So the whole complaint about spellcasters not feeling quite the same fulfillment as like a monk in 5e is actually made a little worse, because this also meant you couldn't do things like ready a cantrip at all, which was something my players had gotten used to in 5e. In addition, rather than unlocking multiple attacks at higher levels, Pathfinder has a multiple attack penalty, meaning you can use additional actions to attempt to attack again, but you have a cumulative penalty that gets higher and higher as you make additional attacks. And my players did not love this part of the system. They'd rather unlock a second attack that's just as good as the first one, rather than start to make the penalty of a second attack less bad as they get higher. So now I have these 2 systems. One with specific action types that lead to unfulfilling turns, and one with a much more complicated action economy that in the abstract seems simpler. So that's when I got the idea of, instead of trying to balance out bonus actions, why not start to balance out the big action, which I started calling the main action. So in Swiftguard, kind of like Pathfinder, on a creature's turn, they get up to 3 actions. Those actions can be used to move, guard, interact with an object, or interact with a part of the environment, or try something creative, but up to 1 of those 3 actions can be a main action, which Pathfinder already kind of had with the flourish tag. You can take up to 1 flourish, but the main action is like the big thing you do during your turn. If it's a martial character, that would be attacking with your weapon, maybe multiple times, or if you're a spellcaster, it's casting your 1 big spell. But now you have these 2 other little actions to kind of play with. If you're a fighter and you don't need to move, instead you might choose to defend yourself and guard, make it harder to hit you over the next round, or use a potion or interact with the environment somehow. In addition, in 5e, my players, when they play with other GMs, would sometimes try to do something creative. Maybe try to intimidate one of the cowardly enemies, or maybe try to use their weapon in an unconventional way. And pretty universally, and no blame to GMs that ruled this way because it was rules as written, they would ask that it cost the full action. And so basically players were like, I could try something creative that is probably going to fail, or I can do something that will work. And to me, that's not really an interesting choice. But with the 3 action economy in Swiftguard, you still can take your main action, but as long as the creative thing isn't something that's going to change the course of the combat, GMs are welcome to let their players attempt, and it only costs 1 of their 3 actions. So it just kind of makes it easier to improvise things within the framework of the same kind of tactical combat that players may have gotten used to with 5e. Something else I borrowed from Pathfinder is the idea of proficiency levels. I totally get how groundbreaking a unified proficiency bonus was when it came out in 5th edition. According to some interviews with the designers, it made the game a lot simpler to design and run, and one long-term effect it had was it really encouraged vertical character progression. Basically, at character creation, your character gets a bunch of proficiencies. Skills, weapons, magic, and as they hit certain levels, whether they multi-classed or not, that character's proficiency bonus would increase, and so these other things they were good at would also increase. But there was no room for other things they hadn't selected at character creation to get better unless they invested feats or multi-class or something like that. A character's path of improvement, therefore, was kind of set at character creation. And again, you would often derail their power accumulation if you attempted to branch away from that at all. So instead, in Swiftguard, each character has proficiency levels, and when you get a feature that may increase your proficiency level, you have the choice of popping up something that they're already good at, or gaining proficiency in something else. Also, little thing on this, saves don't factor in proficiencies. There are 3 saves in the game: Fortitude, Reflex, and Will, also a little Pathfinder-like, also a little D&D 3rd edition-like, but your bonus to those saves equal 2 of your attributes added together. Fortitude is Strength and Constitution, Reflex is Dex and Awareness, and Will is Knowledge and Charisma. So rather than picking proficiencies, instead, as you increase those attributes, you're increasing your defense in that save. Which, especially when it comes to stat block calculations for monsters, it gives monsters some very specific vulnerabilities that when players discover them, it makes them feel a little more rewarded for having a wide variety of tools than just focusing on one thing over and over again. So probably the most controversial design that, again, I'm playtesting, I'm not set on it yet, is cumulative advantage. Rather than rolling 2d20s, take the highest. When your character rolls with advantage, they roll a d20 and a d4, and like Bless, they add the d4 to the d20. Now, if there are 2 sources of advantage, that d4 pops up to a d6. 3 sources, it's a d8, 4, it's a d10, and it caps at a d12 for 5 and any other above. And of course, disadvantage is the opposite of this. It takes away from the roll, and if you have more sources of disadvantage, it gets worse and worse, and advantage, disadvantage cancel each other out. So I know MCDM and Draw Steel tried to play test a similar concept, and what ended up preventing it from working was the same base thing of trying to track multiple sources of advantage and disadvantage. Now I'll admit, I haven't been keeping up with Draw Steel's design. I'm not part of the Patreon or whatever. I haven't seen any of the material myself. I have heard interviews from James Intricasso just talking about it, but I haven't seen it all for myself. So basically, that's all to say. I want to see how it works myself and see what the pitfalls are to inform how I might want to try to keep the idea of cumulative advantage. Because the big thing I like about it is how teammates can work together to contribute to each other's greater success. And I think advantage is a very clear way to convey that, which again leads back to my whole, I think this system can help practice beneficial thought patterns by thinking in terms of how do we as a group help each other succeed, rather than what happens a lot in 5e, which is, oh, they already have advantage because XYZ, I guess I'll just attack. So now I want to hear what you have to say. Are there parts of Swiftguard that you find intriguing? Or, like a lot of people, are you kind of sick of 5e and want to try something that is way more mechanically different? Thanks so much for watching. Swiftguard Playtest Packet 1.2 and Swiftguard Playtest Adventure 1 are available for download in the description below, along with an invite link to the Swiftguard Discord. Remember to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now!